The dusty streets of Independence, Missouri buzzed with the familiar chaos of another wagon train preparing to depart. Elizabeth Harper stood at the window of the boarding house, her delicate fingers pressed against the cool glass as she watched families load their possessions onto covered wagons. The year was 1847. And the promise of new beginnings in the Oregon Territory had captured the hearts of countless Americans seeking fortune and freedom. At 19, Elizabeth possessed a beauty that turned heads wherever she went. Her auburn hair caught the morning sunlight like spun copper, and her emerald eyes held an intelligence that made some men uncomfortable and others utterly captivated. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but even the worn fabric couldn't diminish her natural grace. "Elizabeth, come away from that window," her Aunt Martha called from across the small room. "It's unseemly for a young lady to gawk at strangers." Elizabeth sighed but didn't move. "I'm not gawking, Aunt Martha. I'm observing. There's a difference." Martha Harper was a stern woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. She had taken Elizabeth in after her parents died of cholera 2 years prior, but it was clear she considered her niece more burden than blessing. "Observing, gawking, it matters not. What matters is that Reverend Whitmore will be here within the hour to discuss your future." Martha's voice carried the weight of finality. "You should be grateful that a man of God is willing to take you as his wife, especially considering your circumstances." Elizabeth finally turned from the window, her jaw set with quiet determination. "My circumstances? You mean being orphaned? That's hardly a character flaw, Aunt Martha. Don't be impertinent. I mean your lack of dowry, your stubborn nature, and your unfortunate tendency to speak your mind when silence would be more becoming." Martha smoothed her dark skirts with sharp, efficient movements. "Reverend Whitmore is offering you respectability and a home. In the Oregon Territory, no less, where you'll have the opportunity to help spread the Lord's word among the heathens." The word heathens sat heavy in the air between them. Elizabeth had heard the stories about the native tribes that roamed the Western Territories, some peaceful, others hostile to the endless stream of settlers crossing their ancestral lands. The newspapers painted them as savage and bloodthirsty, but Elizabeth had always wondered if there might be more to the story than what made it into print. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Martha straightened her already perfect posture and moved to answer it, revealing a tall, thin man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person. "Reverend Whitmore," Martha said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Please, come in." Josiah Whitmore stepped into the modest room, his black coat and white collar marking him clearly as a man of the cloth. He carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His gaze swept the room before settling on Elizabeth with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of countless sermons. "You look well." "Thank you, Reverend," Elizabeth replied, offering a small curtsy that felt more like a surrender. "Please, sit." Martha gestured toward the small table where she had arranged their best china, a wedding gift from her own marriage 25 years prior. "I'll prepare some tea." As Martha busied herself with the tea service, Reverend Whitmore took the seat across from Elizabeth. His pale eyes studied her with the same intensity one might use to examine a horse before purchase. "I trust your aunt has explained the nature of my proposal," he began without preamble. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Good. I'll be frank with you, Miss Harper. I'm not a young man, and I have no time for romantic nonsense. I need a wife who can help me establish a proper Christian household in the Oregon Territory. Someone who can assist with my missionary work and bear me children to carry on God's work." The clinical way he spoke about marriage and children made Elizabeth's stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain composed. "And what would you expect of me, specifically?" "Obedience, first and foremost. A wife should be submissive to her husband in all things, as the Bible teaches. You would help me minister to the settlers and work to convert the savage tribes we encounter. It's dangerous work, but rewarding for those with the proper faith and dedication." Martha returned with the tea, her movements quick and nervous. "Elizabeth is a good Christian girl, Reverend. She'll make you a fine wife." "I'm sure she will, with proper guidance." His smile was cold and calculating. "I leave with the Morrison wagon train in 3 days. The wedding will take place tomorrow evening, and will depart the following morning." Elizabeth's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble. "Tomorrow evening? But that's so soon." "There's no point in delay," Reverend Whitmore interrupted. "I've already spoken with Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church. Everything is arranged." The room seemed to close in around Elizabeth as the reality of her situation became clear. She was being sold, perhaps not for money, but certainly for the promise of removing her from Martha's care. The Reverend's cold eyes and calculating manner suggested that life as his wife would be little better than servitude. I need some time to prepare," Elizabeth managed to say. "Of course. Martha has assured me that you have few possessions to pack. That's for the best. We can only take essentials on the trail." He stood, smoothing his black coat. "I'll return tomorrow at 6 o'clock for the ceremony. I trust you'll be ready." After he left, the small room felt suffocating. Martha began clearing the tea service with sharp, efficient movements, avoiding Elizabeth's gaze. "Aunt Martha," Elizabeth said quietly, "I don't think I can do this." Martha's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their task. "You don't have a choice, child. I can't continue to support you, and there are no other prospects. Reverend Whitmore is offering you a future." "But I don't love him. I don't even like him." "Love?" Martha's laugh was bitter. "Love is a luxury for women with means. You have neither money nor family to support you. This marriage will give you security and purpose." Elizabeth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I need some air." Before Martha could protest, Elizabeth was out the door and walking quickly down the dusty street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the air carried the scent of horses, leather, and the promise of rain. She found herself drawn back to the area where the wagon trains gathered. Families were setting up camp for the night, and the sounds of children playing mixed with the lowing of oxen and the creak of wagon wheels. This was the sound of hope, of people willing to risk everything for the chance at a better life. "You look like someone who's carrying the weight of the world." Elizabeth turned to find a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands watching her with concern. She wore a simple brown dress and a bonnet that had seen better days, but her smile was warm and genuine. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Nonsense. I'm Sarah Morrison. My husband's leading this train west. You're welcome to sit a spell if you'd like." She gestured toward a wooden crate that served as a makeshift chair beside her wagon. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before accepting the invitation. "I'm Elizabeth Harper. Pleased to meet you, Elizabeth. You heading west with us?" "It appears so," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's experienced eyes seemed to see more than Elizabeth had intended to reveal. "Appears so? That doesn't sound like someone who's eager for adventure." Elizabeth found herself telling this kind stranger about her situation, the arranged marriage, her lack of options, her fear of what lay ahead. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "That's a hard situation for a young woman," Sarah said when Elizabeth finished. "But I'll tell you something. The trail changes people. Sometimes it brings out the worst in folks, but sometimes it shows them strength they never knew they had." "I don't feel very strong right now." "Strength isn't about feeling brave, honey. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Sarah reached over and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "And if you do end up traveling with us, you won't be alone. Trail families look after each other." As Elizabeth walked back to the boarding house, Sarah's words echoed in her mind. The trail changes people. Perhaps this journey west, despite its frightening beginning, might offer opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Martha's steady breathing from the other bed. Tomorrow evening, she would become Mrs. Josiah Whitmore. The thought made her stomach clench with dread, but beneath the fear, a small spark of something else flickered to life. If the trail could change people, perhaps it could change her too. Perhaps somewhere between Missouri and Oregon, she might find the strength to forge her own path. Regardless of what others had planned for her, the last thing she saw before sleep finally claimed her was the moonlight streaming through the window, illuminating the small bag she had packed with her few possessions. Tomorrow would bring a wedding she didn't want to a man she couldn't love, but it would also bring the beginning of a journey that might lead to something she had never dared to hope for: freedom. The Methodist church was small and plain, its whitewashed walls adorned only with a simple wooden cross behind the altar. Elizabeth stood in the tiny anteroom, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror that hung beside the door. She wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple white gown that Martha had carefully preserved in tissue paper. It fit well enough, though it hung loose in places where Elizabeth's slender frame differed from her mother's more generous curves. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha said, though her voice lacked warmth. She was adjusting Elizabeth's veil, a delicate piece of lace that had belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother. "Your mother would be proud." Elizabeth doubted that. Her mother had married for love, had spoken often of the joy she'd found in her father's arms. She would have been heartbroken to see her daughter entering into such a cold arrangement. "It's time," Pastor Williams announced from the doorway. He was a kindly man in his 60s, with white hair and gentle eyes that seemed troubled by the hastiness of this union. "Are you ready, Miss Harper?" No, Elizabeth thought, but she nodded anyway. Ready or not, the moment had arrived. The church was nearly empty. Martha sat in the front pew, her face a mask of satisfaction. A few of Reverend Whitmore's traveling companions occupied the other front pew, stern-faced men and women who looked at Elizabeth with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Sarah Morrison was there too, having insisted on attending to offer support to the young bride. Her presence was a small comfort in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Reverend Whitmore stood at the altar in his best black suit, his pale eyes fixed on Elizabeth as she walked down the short aisle. There was no music, no flowers, no celebration, just the hollow echo of her footsteps on the wooden floor and the weight of her impending fate. Pastor Williams began the ceremony with a brief prayer, his voice carrying easily through the small space. Elizabeth tried to focus on his words, but they seemed to come from very far away. She felt as though she were watching this happen to someone else, as though her spirit had somehow separated from her body to observe this tragedy from a safe distance. Do you, Josiah Whitmore, take Elizabeth Harper to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. His voice was firm and confident, as though he were accepting a business proposition rather than a life partner. And do you, Elizabeth Harper, take Josiah Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? The words stuck in Elizabeth's throat. The church fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Everyone waited. Reverend Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly, and Martha leaned forward in her pew. Elizabeth began, then stopped. Through the church's single window, she could see the wagon train in the distance. Families gathered around their evening fires, children playing in the fading light. Freedom was so close, she could almost taste it. I do, she whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal of everything she believed about love and marriage. By the power vested in me by God and the state of Missouri, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Reverend Whitmore's kiss was brief and cold, his lips barely brushing hers before he stepped back. There was no warmth in it, no promise of affection to come. It was merely a formality to be completed before moving on to more important matters. Congratulations, Pastor Williams said, though his smile seemed forced. May God bless your union. The small gathering dispersed quickly. Martha embraced Elizabeth briefly, her duty finally complete. Be a good wife, she whispered, and remember your place. Sarah Morrison approached as the others filed out. I'll be praying for you, honey, she said, squeezing Elizabeth's hands. Remember what I told you about finding your strength. Reverend Whitmore, her husband now, Elizabeth reminded herself with a shudder, was already discussing departure times with his traveling companions. He barely glanced at Elizabeth as he spoke about supply lists and travel schedules, as though she were simply another piece of equipment to be loaded onto the wagon. We'll spend tonight at the boarding house, he informed her when the church had emptied. We depart at dawn. I trust you're packed and ready. Yes, Elizabeth replied, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. The walk back to the boarding house was conducted in silence. Reverend Whitmore strode ahead with purposeful steps, while Elizabeth followed a few paces behind, her wedding dress rustling softly in the evening breeze. She felt like a ghost, a pale shadow of the woman she had been just hours before. Martha had prepared a simple wedding supper, roasted chicken, potatoes, and green beans. But Elizabeth could barely manage a few bites. Her new husband ate with methodical efficiency, discussing the challenges they would face on the trail as though she were a fellow minister rather than his bride. The journey will take approximately 5 months, he said between bites. We'll face river crossings, mountain passes, and potentially hostile Indians. You'll need to be strong and obedient if we're to survive." "I understand," Elizabeth replied, though she wondered if she truly did. "Good. I've arranged for separate sleeping quarters tonight, as I believe it's important to begin our marriage with proper Christian restraint. We'll have plenty of time to fulfill our marital duties once we're settled in Oregon." Elizabeth felt a rush of relief, so strong it nearly made her dizzy. She had been dreading this night almost as much as the marriage itself. "That's very considerate of you." "I'm a man of God, Elizabeth. I don't act on base impulses like some common frontiersman." His pale eyes studied her with that same calculating expression she had noticed during their first meeting. "However, I do expect children from this union, several children, to help with our missionary work." The thought of bearing this cold man's children made Elizabeth's stomach turn, but she managed to nod. "Of course." After supper, Martha showed Elizabeth to the small room she would occupy for her final night as a single woman. Technically, she supposed, her first night as a married woman, though it felt more like a reprieve than a beginning. "I've left your mother's Bible on the nightstand," Martha said. "Perhaps you'll find comfort in the scriptures." After Martha left, Elizabeth sat on the narrow bed and opened the worn leather Bible. Her mother had written notes in the margins, little observations and prayers that revealed her gentle, loving nature. Elizabeth traced the familiar handwriting with her finger, wishing desperately that her mother were here to offer guidance and comfort. She turned to the Book of Ruth, her mother's favorite, and read the familiar words, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." The words had always seemed romantic to Elizabeth when her mother read them aloud, a testament to love and loyalty. Now they felt like a prophecy of her own fate, bound to follow a man she didn't love, to a place she had never seen, among people who would never truly be her own. She closed the Bible and prepared for bed, changing from her wedding dress into a simple white nightgown. As she hung the dress carefully in the wardrobe, she noticed a small tear in the hem where it had caught on the church steps. Even her mother's dress had been damaged by this unwanted union. Sleep was elusive. Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the sounds of the town settling into night. Dogs barking in the distance, the occasional clip-clop of a late horse, the murmur of voices from the saloon down the street. Tomorrow, she would leave all of this behind for the vast uncertainty of the Western Territories. Sometime near midnight, she heard the sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves. Through her small window, she could see torches moving in the darkness as late arrivals joined the Morrison train. Even now, people were making their way toward new lives and new possibilities. Elizabeth pressed her face against the cool glass and made a silent promise to herself. She might be trapped in this marriage for now, but she would not let it destroy her spirit. Somehow, some way, she would find her own path to freedom. The trail might change people, as Sarah Morrison had said, and perhaps it would change her into someone strong enough to claim the life she truly wanted. As dawn approached, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of endless prairies and endless possibilities stretching out before her, like an ocean of grass beneath an infinite sky. Dawn came too soon, announced by the raucous crowing of roosters and the immediate bustle of a town preparing for another day. Elizabeth had slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of endless trails and faceless dangers. She dressed quickly in her traveling clothes, a practical brown dress with a matching bonnet, sturdy boots that had belonged to her mother, and a heavy woolen cloak for the cool mornings. Her possessions fit into a single carpet bag, 2 additional dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible and jewelry, a daguerreotype of her parents, and a few personal items that held sentimental value. It seemed a pitifully small collection to represent 19 years of life, but Reverend Whitmore had been clear about the weight restrictions for their wagon. Martha was already dressed and preparing breakfast when Elizabeth emerged from her room. "You'll want to eat well," her aunt advised, without looking up from the stove. "It may be your last hot meal for some time." Elizabeth managed to choke down some eggs and biscuits, though her stomach was twisted with anxiety. Through the window, she could see the wagon train forming up in the distance, families making final preparations for the long journey ahead. Reverend Whitmore arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, as punctual as Elizabeth had expected. He wore practical traveling clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest, but still maintained the rigid bearing that marked him as a man of the cloth. "Good morning, Elizabeth," he said formally. "I trust you're ready to depart." "Yes," she replied, shouldering her carpet bag. "Good. Our wagon is loaded and waiting. We'll be traveling with the Morrison train, as I mentioned. Captain Morrison runs a disciplined operation, which I appreciate." Martha embraced Elizabeth briefly at the door. "Remember your duties as a wife," she whispered, "and write when you can." Elizabeth nodded, though she wondered when she might have the opportunity to send letters back to Missouri. The Western Territories were vast and largely unsettled, with mail service sporadic at best. The walk to the wagon train took only a few minutes, but it felt like crossing into another world. The organized chaos of departure was overwhelming. Families loading last-minute supplies, children chasing each other between the wagons, men checking harnesses and oxen, women calling out instructions and farewells. Their wagon was smaller than Elizabeth had expected, a simple canvas-covered affair pulled by 2 sturdy oxen. Most of the space was taken up with supplies: barrels of flour and salt pork, tools, ammunition, medical supplies, and religious materials for Reverend Whitmore's missionary work. "You'll walk most of the way," her husband informed her as they approached the wagon. "The oxen can't handle the weight of passengers except in emergencies. It's actually better for your health. The exercise will keep you strong." Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of walking 2,000 miles was daunting. She had never traveled more than a few miles from Independence in her entire life. "Reverend Whitmore!" a booming voice called out. Elizabeth turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching them. This had to be Captain Morrison, Sarah's husband. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent years on the frontier, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Captain Morrison," Reverend Whitmore replied with a slight nod. "We're ready to depart." "Good to hear. I was just going over the rules with the other families. Since you're new to the train, I'll give you the same briefing." Captain Morrison's gaze included Elizabeth as he spoke. "We travel as a community out here. Everyone contributes, everyone follows orders, and everyone looks out for their neighbors. The trail doesn't forgive mistakes or selfishness." "I understand completely," Reverend Whitmore said. "We're prepared to do our part." "I'm sure you are. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll find the other women very welcoming. Trail life can be hard on ladies, but we all help each other through it. Elizabeth started slightly at being called Mrs. Whitmore. The name still felt foreign and uncomfortable. "Thank you, Captain Morrison. I appreciate that. Sarah's been looking forward to having another young woman on the train. She'll help you get settled." He tipped his hat to Elizabeth before turning back to her husband. "We'll be moving out in 30 minutes. Keep your wagon in line and follow the signals." As Captain Morrison walked away, Elizabeth caught sight of Sarah Morrison waving from a wagon several positions ahead. The older woman's friendly face was a welcome sight in the sea of strangers. "Remember," Reverend Whitmore said quietly, "you represent me and our mission now. Your behavior reflects on both of us. I expect you to be modest, helpful, and obedient at all times." "I understand," Elizabeth replied, though she bristled at being spoken to like a child. The call to move out came sooner than expected. "Wagons ho!" Captain Morrison's voice carried across the entire train, and suddenly the Great Migration was underway. Elizabeth walked beside their wagon as it lurched into motion, the wooden wheels creaking and the canvas cover flapping in the morning breeze. The oxen plodded forward with patient determination, their massive heads swaying with each step. For the first few miles, the excitement of departure sustained everyone's spirits. Children ran alongside the wagons, dogs barked and chased after rabbits, and the adults called out cheerful conversations across the train. Elizabeth found herself caught up in the infectious optimism, her own fears temporarily forgotten in the face of such collective hope and determination. But as the morning wore on and the miles accumulated, the reality of their undertaking began to settle in. The sun grew hot. Dust kicked up by the wagons ahead coated everything in a fine layer of grit, and the novelty of walking began to wear off. Elizabeth's feet, unaccustomed to such sustained exercise, started to ache in her boots. "You'll toughen up," said a voice beside her. Elizabeth turned to see a woman about her own age walking alongside the neighboring wagon. She had dark hair braided back from her face and wore a practical calico dress that had clearly seen plenty of wear. "I'm Mary Patterson. My husband Tom and I are heading to Oregon to start a farm." "Elizabeth Will?" She caught herself. "Elizabeth Whitmore. Pleased to meet you." "Newlyweds?" Mary asked with a knowing smile. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her true feelings about the marriage. "How exciting. Tom and I have been married 3 years now. We're hoping Oregon will give us the chance to build something of our own." Mary's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. "What takes you and your husband west?" "Reverend Whitmore is a missionary. We're going to minister to the settlers and the native tribes." Mary's expression grew more serious. "That's brave work. We've heard stories about some of the tribes being hostile to settlers." "What kind of stories?" Elizabeth asked, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "Oh, the usual tales. Raids on isolated homesteads. Travelers disappearing on the trail. But Captain Morrison says most of the tribes are peaceful if you treat them with respect. It's usually the bad behavior of some settlers that causes trouble." Elizabeth found this perspective interesting. The newspapers back in Missouri had painted all Indians as savage threats to civilization, but Mary's more nuanced view suggested the reality might be more complicated. As they walked, Mary pointed out other families on the train, sharing what she knew about their stories and destinations. There were farmers seeking fertile land, merchants hoping to establish businesses in the growing western towns, and families simply looking for a fresh start away from the crowded eastern states. "And that's the Johnson family," Mary said, indicating a wagon near the front of the train. They're traveling with their 3 children and Mrs. Johnson's elderly father. The old man fought in the War of 1812, has some fascinating stories. Elizabeth was grateful for Mary's friendly chatter. It helped distract her from her aching feet and the growing heat of the day. But she was also aware of Reverend Whitmore, walking on the other side of their wagon, occasionally glancing over to monitor her conversation. Around midday, Captain Morrison called a halt for the noon meal. The wagons formed a loose circle, and families gathered in whatever shade they could find. Elizabeth helped Reverend Whitmore prepare a simple meal of hardtack, dried meat, and water, though her husband did most of the work, while lecturing her on proper trail cooking techniques. "You'll need to learn quickly," he said as he built a small fire. "I can't be responsible for all the domestic duties while also tending to my ministerial obligations." "Of course," Elizabeth replied, though she noticed that many of the other husbands were helping their wives with cooking and camp setup. Reverend Whitmore seemed to view such assistance as beneath his dignity. Sarah Morrison approached their camp with a warm smile. "How are you holding up, dear?" she asked Elizabeth. "Very well, thank you," Elizabeth replied, grateful for the older woman's concern. "The first day is always the hardest. Your body needs time to adjust to the routine." Sarah glanced at Reverend Whitmore, who was reading his Bible while Elizabeth tended the fire. "If you need anything, advice, supplies, or just someone to talk to, don't hesitate to ask." "I appreciate that more than you know," Elizabeth said sincerely. After the meal, they resumed their westward journey. The afternoon sun was brutal, and Elizabeth's dress was soon soaked with perspiration. Her feet had developed painful blisters, and the constant dust made her throat raw despite frequent sips from her water bottle. But as the day progressed, she began to notice things that lifted her spirits. The landscape was gradually changing from the familiar farmland of Missouri to something wilder and more open. Wildflowers dotted the prairie in brilliant splashes of color, and the sky seemed impossibly vast compared to the tree-lined horizons she was used to. She also began to appreciate the rhythm of trail life. Despite the hardships, there was something deeply satisfying about the steady progress westward, the sense of moving towards something new and unknown. For the first time since her parents' death, Elizabeth felt a stirring of hope for the future. As evening approached, Captain Morrison began looking for a suitable campsite. They needed access to water and grass for the animals, as well as defensible ground in case of trouble. When he finally called a halt, Elizabeth was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "We made good time today," Mary Patterson said as the women gathered to prepare the evening meal. 15 miles, according to my husband's calculations. 15 miles closer to Oregon, Elizabeth thought. 15 miles farther from the life that had been chosen for her. Perhaps the trail really would change her, as Sarah Morrison had suggested. Perhaps somewhere in those 2,000 miles, she would find the strength to become the woman she was meant to be. As she helped Reverend Whitmore set up their camp for the night, Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine what that woman might look like. Strong, certainly, independent, free to make her own choices about love and life and faith. It was a dangerous dream, she knew. But as the sun set over the endless prairie and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elizabeth held on to that dream like a lifeline. Whatever lay ahead on the trail to Oregon, she would face it with hope in her heart and determination in her soul. 3 weeks into their journey, the initial excitement of the trail had given way to a grinding routine of early mornings, long days of walking, and exhausted evenings around smoky campfires. Elizabeth's feet had toughened. Her hands had developed calluses from helping with camp chores, and her fair skin had bronzed despite her bonnet and long sleeves. The landscape had changed dramatically since leaving Missouri. Gone were the familiar forests and farmlands, replaced by an endless sea of prairie grass that rippled in the constant wind like waves on a green ocean. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching from horizon to horizon without interruption. And the silence was both beautiful and unsettling. Elizabeth had settled into the rhythm of trail life better than she had expected. She walked alongside their wagon during the day, often chatting with Mary Patterson or other women from the train. In the evenings, she helped prepare meals and tend to camp duties while Reverend Whitmore conducted prayer services for those families who wished to attend. Her husband had proven to be exactly what she had feared: cold, demanding, and utterly focused on his mission to the exclusion of any personal warmth. He treated her more like an assistant than a wife, giving orders and expecting immediate compliance. Elizabeth had learned to bite her tongue and follow his instructions, but resentment was building like pressure in a steam kettle. "Elizabeth," Reverend Whitmore called from beside their wagon. "Come here immediately." She hurried over, wondering what she had done wrong this time. Her husband was standing with Captain Morrison and 2 other men she didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals with weathered faces and clothes that had seen hard use. "These gentlemen are scouts," Reverend Whitmore explained. "They've brought news about the trail ahead." The older of the 2 scouts, a grizzled man with a gray beard and piercing blue eyes, nodded to Elizabeth before addressing the group. "Name's Jake Sullivan. This here's my partner, Pete Hawkins. We've been riding ahead of your train, checking conditions." "What did you find?" Captain Morrison asked. "Good news and bad news," Sullivan replied. "Good news is the weather's holding and the grass is still good for your livestock. Bad news is we've got Indian sign about 2 days ahead." Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten with fear. The newspapers back in Missouri had been full of stories about Indian attacks on wagon trains, though Mary Patterson had suggested these accounts might be exaggerated. "What kind of sign?" Captain Morrison asked calmly. "Tracks mostly. Unshod ponies, maybe 20 or 30 riders. Could be Cheyenne, could be Arapaho. Hard to tell for certain." Sullivan spat into the dust. "Might be nothing. Could just be a hunting party minding their own business. But you'll want to keep your people alert." "Any signs of hostility?" Reverend Whitmore asked. "Not so far, but that can change quick out here. Indians are unpredictable, friendly one day, hostile the next." Pete Hawkins spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a harsh edge. "Best to assume they're dangerous and act accordingly." Captain Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "We'll double the night watch and keep the wagons closer together. Any other recommendations?" "Keep your weapons handy, but don't go looking for trouble," Sullivan advised. "Most Indians will leave you alone if you don't provoke them. But if they do decide to cause problems, you'll want to be ready." After the scouts left to report to other families, Elizabeth found herself walking beside Mary Patterson, both women subdued by the news. "Are you frightened?" Mary asked quietly. "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted. "I've never seen an Indian in my life. I don't know what to expect. My Tom says most of them are just trying to live their lives, same as us. But there are bad ones, just like there are bad white men." Mary adjusted her bonnet against the afternoon sun. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough. That evening, the atmosphere around the campfires was noticeably tense. Men cleaned their rifles and checked their ammunition, while women gathered their children closer than usual. Reverend Whitmore conducted an especially fervent prayer service, asking for divine protection against the heathen savages they might encounter. Elizabeth found his language troubling. She had been reading her mother's Bible more frequently during the journey, and the Jesus she found in those pages seemed more interested in loving one's enemies than in condemning them as savages. But she kept these thoughts to herself, knowing that any disagreement with her husband's theology would be met with harsh correction. The next day dawned gray and windy, with heavy clouds building on the western horizon. The train made good time despite the threatening weather, but everyone remained on edge, scanning the prairie for any sign of the Indian party the scouts had reported. It was mid-afternoon when the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the scattered drops had become a steady downpour, and within an hour, they were caught in a full-scale prairie storm. The wind howled across the open grassland, driving the rain horizontally and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. "We need to find shelter," Captain Morrison shouted over the storm, but there was no shelter to be found on the open prairie. The wagons pressed on, their canvas covers providing little protection against the driving rain. Elizabeth was soaked within minutes, her heavy skirts clinging to her legs and making walking even more difficult. The trail had turned to mud, and the wagon wheels began to sink deeper with each rotation. Several times, she had to help push their wagon out of particularly deep ruts, her hands slipping on the wet wood and her boots sliding in the treacherous mud. "This is intolerable," Reverend Whitmore shouted from beneath the wagon's canvas cover, where he had taken refuge. "We should stop and wait for the storm to pass." But Captain Morrison kept the train moving. Elizabeth later learned that stopping in such conditions could be even more dangerous. Wagons could become hopelessly mired, and the exposed position on the open prairie offered no protection from lightning or flash floods. As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified rather than diminishing. Lightning cracked across the sky with terrifying frequency, and the thunder was so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The oxen became increasingly difficult to control, their eyes rolling white with fear as they struggled through the deepening mud. It was during one particularly violent lightning strike that disaster struck. The Johnson family's wagon, traveling several positions ahead of the Whitmores, hit a hidden washout in the trail. Elizabeth watched in horror as the wagon tilted sharply to one side, then toppled completely over, spilling its contents and passengers into the muddy water. "Help them!" Sarah Morrison screamed, and immediately several men rushed toward the overturned wagon, despite the dangerous conditions. Elizabeth found herself running too, her feet sliding in the mud, but her determination overriding her fear. She reached the accident site just as Tom Patterson and two other men were pulling Mrs. Johnson and her 3 children from beneath the wagon's canvas cover. "Where's grandfather?" Mrs. Johnson cried, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Where's my father?" Elizabeth looked around frantically and spotted an elderly man lying motionless about 20 feet from the wagon, apparently thrown clear when it overturned. Without thinking, she ran to him, dropping to her knees in the mud beside his still form. The old man, she remembered Mary saying his name was Samuel, was unconscious but breathing. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, Elizabeth had no medical training, but her instincts told her he needed to be moved to shelter immediately. "Help me," she called to the nearest man, who turned out to be P. Hawkins, one of the scouts. Together, they carefully lifted the injured man and carried him to the Morrison wagon, which Sarah had quickly converted into a makeshift medical station. "Broken arm for certain," Sarah said after a quick examination. "Possible concussion too. We need to get him dry and warm." For the next hour, Elizabeth worked alongside Sarah and the other women to treat the injured and salvage what they could from the overturned wagon. Her expensive traveling dress was ruined. Her hands were cut and bleeding from handling splintered wood, and she was exhausted beyond measure. But she had never felt more useful or more alive. "Elizabeth!" Reverend Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "What are you doing? Get back to our wagon immediately." She looked up from where she was helping to bandage Samuel's arm. "I'm helping with the injured. They need nothing from you except prayer. Your place is with your husband, not gallivanting around in the mud like a common field hand." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Around her, the other women continued their work, but she could feel their eyes on her, witnessing her humiliation. "Go on, dear," Sarah Morrison said quietly. "We can manage from here." Reluctantly, Elizabeth made her way back to their wagon, where Reverend Whitmore waited with a thunderous expression. "Get inside and change into dry clothes," he ordered, "and don't ever embarrass me like that again." "I was helping people who were hurt," Elizabeth protested. "Surely that's Christian," but she bit back her response and climbed into the wagon to change clothes, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. As she struggled out of her wet dress in the cramped confines of the wagon, Elizabeth made a decision. She would continue to help where she could, regardless of her husband's disapproval. If that made her a bad wife in his eyes, so be it. She was discovering that there were things more important than wifely obedience. Things like compassion, courage, and the simple human duty to help those in need. The storm finally passed near sunset, leaving the train exhausted and bedraggled, but still intact. The Johnson wagon was a total loss, but Captain Morrison quickly reorganized the remaining wagons to accommodate the displaced family. Samuel's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening, and the other family members had escaped with only minor cuts and bruises. That night, as Elizabeth lay in her bedroll listening to her husband's steady breathing, she thought about the day's events. She had discovered something about herself in the chaos of the storm, a strength and capability she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she had a purpose beyond simply surviving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and somewhere ahead lay the Indian party that had the entire train on edge. But Elizabeth found herself looking forward to whatever came next, with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The trail was changing her, just as Sarah Morrison had predicted. The question was, what kind of woman would emerge from this crucible of hardship and adventure? As sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth dreamed not of the comfortable parlors of Missouri, but of endless prairies and infinite skies, of challenges met and obstacles overcome. In her dreams, she was strong and free and unafraid, everything she was determined to become in waking life. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, with the prairie grass sparkling with droplets that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed by the previous day's downpour, but the trail remained treacherous with mud and hidden washouts. Elizabeth woke before dawn as had become her habit, and quietly prepared breakfast, while Reverend Whitmore continued to sleep. She had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the camp stirred to life, the only time when she felt truly free from his constant criticism and demands. As she tended the small fire and prepared coffee, she noticed unusual activity near Captain Morrison's wagon. Several men were gathered in hushed conversation, their expressions serious and alert. Jake Sullivan, the scout, was among them, gesturing toward the western horizon as he spoke in low, urgent tones. Elizabeth, Reverend Whitmore's voice from inside the wagon made her jump. "What's that commotion about?" "I'm not sure," she replied honestly. "The men seem to be discussing something with the scout." Reverend Whitmore emerged from the wagon, his hair disheveled and his expression already stern despite the early hour. He strode toward the gathering of men, leaving Elizabeth to finish breakfast preparations alone. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was grim. "The Indians the scouts reported yesterday. They're close. Sullivan spotted their camp about 5 miles ahead." Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten with fear. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we proceed with extreme caution. Captain Morrison wants to try peaceful contact first, but we must be prepared for the worst." He fixed her with his pale, cold eyes. "You will stay close to the wagon at all times. If there's trouble, you're to— And Elizabeth, if something happens to me, you're to seek protection with Captain Morrison's family. Don't try to be heroic. Your safety is more important than any misguided notions of adventure." It was perhaps the closest thing to genuine concern for her welfare that he had ever expressed, and Elizabeth found herself oddly touched despite her complicated feelings about their marriage. The train formed up more tightly than usual that morning, with the wagons closer together and armed men positioned at regular intervals. The atmosphere was tense but determined. These were people who had already come too far to turn back now, regardless of what dangers lay ahead. As they began their westward progress, Elizabeth found herself walking closer to the wagon than usual, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The prairie seemed endless and empty, but she knew that could be deceptive. An entire war party could be hidden in the tall grass, just yards away without being detected. It was mid-morning when they saw the first Indian. He appeared on a low rise, about half a mile to the south, sitting motionless on his horse and watching the wagon train's progress. Even at that distance, Elizabeth could see that he was a magnificent figure, tall and straight in the saddle, his long black hair flowing in the wind, his bronze skin gleaming in the sunlight. "There's one of them," Mary Patterson said quietly, moving closer to Elizabeth. "He doesn't look very threatening." Elizabeth had to agree. The lone rider seemed more curious than hostile, content to observe from a safe distance. But as they continued westward, more riders appeared on the surrounding hills. First 2, then 5, then a dozen or more. They maintained their distance, but clearly paralleled the wagon train's movement. "They're just watching us," Tom Patterson observed to his wife. "Maybe they're as nervous about us as we are about them." Captain Morrison called a halt around noon, choosing a defensive position on slightly elevated ground near a small creek. The wagons were arranged in a tight circle, with the livestock herded into the center, and armed men positioned around the perimeter. "I'm going to try to make contact," Captain Morrison announced to the gathered families. "Jake Sullivan speaks some Cheyenne, and will approach under a flag of truce. If they're peaceful, we might be able to trade for supplies, or at least ensure safe passage." "Is that wise?" Reverend Whitmore asked. "These savages can't be trusted. They might see any approach as a sign of weakness." Captain Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Reverend, I've been leading wagon trains for 8 years. I've found that treating people with respect, regardless of their race, usually gets better results than assuming the worst about them." Elizabeth felt a surge of admiration for the captain's measured approach. It seemed far more Christian than her husband's immediate assumption of hostility. The parley took place about 200 yards from the circled wagons, in full view of both groups. Captain Morrison and Jake Sullivan rode out under a white flag, while 3 Indian riders approached from the opposite direction. Elizabeth watched tensely as the 2 groups met and began what appeared to be a peaceful conversation. "What do you think they're saying?" Mary Patterson whispered. "Hopefully negotiating safe passage," Elizabeth replied, though her heart was pounding with anxiety. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes before the Indian riders turned and rode back toward their companions. Captain Morrison and Sullivan returned to the wagon train with expressions that were difficult to read. "They're Cheyenne," Captain Morrison reported to the gathered families, "a hunting party led by a war chief named Standing Bear. They're not looking for trouble, but they want to make sure we're not either." "What does that mean?" someone called out. "It means we can continue on our way, but they'll be watching us. They want assurance that we won't hunt their buffalo or cause damage to their lands. In return, they'll leave us alone." "And you trust them?" Reverend Whitmore asked skeptically. "I trust that they have as much interest in avoiding bloodshed as we do," Captain Morrison replied. "They have families to protect too." The agreement seemed to satisfy most of the families, and the train prepared to resume its westward journey. But as they were hitching up the oxen, a commotion arose near the creek where some of the women had gone to refill water barrels. "Help!" Mary Patterson's voice carried clearly across the camp. "Mrs. Johnson's collapsed!" Elizabeth ran toward the creek along with several other women, her heart racing with concern. They found Mrs. Johnson lying unconscious beside the water, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Her elderly father, Samuel, sat nearby, his broken arm still in a sling from the previous day's accident. "She just fell over," Samuel explained, his voice shaky with worry. One minute she was filling the water barrel, the next she was on the ground. Sarah Morrison knelt beside the unconscious woman, checking her pulse and breathing. "She's burning with fever. Probably caught something in yesterday's storm. Pneumonia, maybe, or something worse." "What can we do?" Elizabeth asked, kneeling beside Sarah. "Not much, I'm afraid. We need to keep her warm and dry. Give her fluids if she wakes up, and pray." Sarah's expression was grim, but she's in bad shape. The stress of the journey, the accident yesterday, sleeping in wet clothes, it's all taken its toll. As they carefully moved Mrs. Johnson to a makeshift bed in one of the wagons, Elizabeth became aware of a presence nearby. She looked up to see one of the Cheyenne riders sitting on his horse about 50 yards away, watching the activity around the sick woman with apparent interest. This was her first close look at one of the Indians, and she was struck by how different he appeared from the savage caricatures she had seen in newspaper illustrations. He was young, perhaps in his 20s, with strong, handsome features and intelligent dark eyes. His long black hair was adorned with feathers and beads, and he wore buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. There was nothing savage or threatening about his appearance. If anything, he looked noble and dignified. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elizabeth felt a strange jolt of recognition. as though she were seeing something familiar in a completely foreign context. The young warrior's expression was serious but not hostile, and she sensed curiosity rather than malice in his steady gaze. "Elizabeth," Reverend Whitmore's sharp voice broke the spell. "Get away from there immediately." She turned to see her husband striding toward her, his face dark with anger. "I told you to stay close to the wagon. What are you doing gawking at that savage?" "I was helping with Mrs. Johnson," Elizabeth protested. "She's very ill. That's not your concern. Sarah Morrison can handle it." He grabbed her arm roughly and began pulling her away from the group of women. "And stop staring at that Indian. It's unseemly." As they walked back toward their wagon, Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder and saw that the young Cheyenne warrior was still watching. But now his expression had changed, and she thought she detected disapproval in his dark eyes, not directed at her, but at the man who was treating her so roughly. The train resumed its journey shortly afterward, with Mrs. Johnson's wagon modified to provide a more comfortable bed for the sick woman. The Cheyenne riders continued to parallel their movement, maintaining their distance, but clearly keeping watch over the white travelers. Elizabeth found herself looking for the young warrior throughout the afternoon, though she was careful not to let Reverend Whitmore notice her interest. There was something about the Indian that intrigued her, a dignity and presence that seemed to command respect rather than fear. As evening approached and the train began looking for a suitable campsite, Elizabeth wondered what the night would bring. The Cheyenne were still out there, watching and waiting. Mrs. Johnson's condition continued to deteriorate, and the atmosphere in the camp remained tense, despite the apparent truce. But beneath her anxiety about these immediate concerns, Elizabeth felt something else stirring, a curiosity about the people who called this vast prairie home, and particularly about the young warrior whose steady gaze had seemed to see straight into her soul. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to change forever, or that the young Cheyenne watching from the hills would soon become the most important person in her world. All she knew was that something significant was happening, something that would test everything she thought she knew about herself, her faith, and her future. As the sun set over the endless grassland and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elizabeth prepared for another night on the